It was the winter of 1945. The war was gasping its final, broken breaths across the blood-stained fields of Europe. The Reich had fallen silent in places once filled with marching boots and burning skies. And in the heart of that silence, among wire fences and wary eyes, stood a group of German women prisoners of war, their uniforms tattered, their hands trembling against the cold iron of captivity. They had been soldiers once, nurses, messengers. Some were merely swept up in the chaos, branded as enemies by circumstance. But now they were captives, far from home, hearts heavy with guilt and fear, waiting for punishment from the victors. Yet what came next was something none of them expected. When the gates of the American run camp opened, they didn't see brutality. They didn't see vengeance. Instead, they saw steaming pots of soup, freshly baked bread, smiling faces of young American soldiers who didn't raise rifles, but ladles. The aroma of real food, not rations, not scraps, filled the air. And for the first time in months, these women felt something they thought the war had killed forever. Kindness. They were fed like family, seated side by side with their former enemies, and the realization shattered whatever armor their hearts still wore. Tears fell silently into bowls of warm stew. In that moment, the war was over, not on paper but in the soul. When the transport trucks stopped, the women didn't know if the rumble beneath their feet had finally ended, or if this was another cruel turn in their journey through the ruins of war. The year was 1945, the year Germany collapsed into silence. For months, these women had traveled through bombed-out cities, broken farmlands, and the ghostly aftermath of what was once home. The convoy that carried them now came to a slow, grinding halt before a set of tall gates wrapped in barbed wire. Every heartbeat was heavy with fear. Their uniforms were worn thin, their shoes torn, their faces hollowed by hunger and exhaustion. They had been prisoners for days, maybe weeks. Time had stopped meaning anything once the surrender came. The air was thick with dust as they climbed down from the trucks. Some stumbled, others were helped by those beside them. They had learned to expect cruelty, harsh voices, the butt of a rifle, the humiliation of being herded like animals. But this camp was quiet. The guards didn't bark orders. The gates opened slowly, creaking, and beyond them was not the nightmare they'd imagined, but something that made them hesitate in disbelief. There were no shouting officers, no snarling dogs. Instead, the faint sound of conversation carried through the air, and with it a smell. Not the familiar stench of burning oil or rotting food that haunted the last months of the war. This was something different, something alive. It smelled like home, like kitchens before the bombs, like bread. One woman, barely 20, froze in place. Her lips trembled as she whispered in disbelief, "Brought." The others turned to her eyes wide, because they smelled it too. Somewhere beyond those fences, bread was baking. The guards, Americans, young and clean-shaven, stood watching. Their expressions weren't cruel. Some even looked nervous, as if unsure what to do with these gaunt, frightened women in torn Wehrmacht uniforms. One of the soldiers stepped forward, his helmet tilted back, revealing eyes too kind for a prison camp. He motioned for them to follow. They walked in silence, their boots crunching over gravel, the sound of their steps strangely human after months of chaos. Around them were rows of neatly built barracks, each with whitewashed walls and orderly fences. Laundry hung in the distance. It wasn't luxury, but it wasn't hell either. One woman turned to another and whispered, "This can't be real." Inside the camp's courtyard, they were told to wait. Their captors spoke in calm, clipped tones. English words they didn't fully understand, but the gestures were clear enough. One soldier brought out a metal container filled with water and held it toward them. At first, no one moved. They had been tricked before in other places. But when he stepped closer and offered it again, this time with a soft nod, one woman stepped forward and took the cup. The water was cold, pure, and real. She drank slowly, eyes filling with tears. She tried to hide. It had been months since any of them had tasted clean water. Another soldier appeared, carrying bread, thick slices of soft, pale bread that still smelled of yeast and warmth. He handed it out gently, one piece at a time. The women reached out with shaking hands, not knowing whether to thank him or fear him. They had been trained to see the Americans as monsters. But these weren't monsters. They were boys, some no older than their own sons or brothers, moving with a kind of hesitant compassion. One woman, her name Anna, bit into her bread slowly, as if afraid it would vanish. The taste was overwhelming, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was ordinary, simple, honest. The kind of food she hadn't seen since her kitchen back in Stuttgart, before the sirens, before the loss. The crust crumbled softly between her fingers. Her throat tightened. She looked up, met the soldier's eyes, and saw no hatred there, only exhaustion. Perhaps they were both just tired of it all. The group was led to a clearing near the barracks. There were no whips, no chains, only the sound of the wind brushing through the trees that bordered the camp. One by one, they were assigned spots to rest. Straw mats, blankets, even small pillows. The women were stunned into silence. It wasn't comfort, not truly. But after the filth of transport trucks and the endless mud of war, this felt like mercy. One woman began to cry softly. The sound caught in her throat at first, then broke free like something long held back. Others followed, not from pain, but from confusion, from the unbearable strangeness of being treated gently after so much hate. The guards didn't interrupt. They simply stood back waiting, as if they understood that this silence, this fragile peace, needed to exist without intrusion. In the distance, a bell rang. Somewhere in the camp, men laughed quietly, and pots clanged. The smell of cooking drifted stronger now, curling through the air and wrapping around the women like a ghost of better times. It wasn't the smell of war food, not the metallic tang of tinned rations or the burnt bitterness of desperation. It was meat, onions, something warm simmering. Anna whispered to her friend Greta, "They're cooking for us." Greta shook her head slowly. "Not for us. For themselves." But when a soldier approached with a gesture, pointing toward a nearby mess tent, and motioned for them to follow, the women realized how wrong they were. The Americans were not just feeding their own. They were preparing food for the prisoners. Inside the tent, wooden tables stretched in neat rows, tin cups lined up like soldiers, steam rising from kettles. It was surreal, almost theatrical. Some of the women hesitated at the entrance, clutching at their coats, unwilling to believe what they saw. One guard motioned again, his face serious but gentle. The women obeyed. They sat on benches, eyes darting around, waiting for the cruelty to reveal itself. But instead, another soldier came forward, carrying a pot. The smell made their stomachs ache. He began to ladle stew into each bowl, not rushing, not careless, almost respectfully. One of the women reached out to steady her bowl with trembling hands, and he gave a small nod, as if to say, "It's all right." In that moment, the war, the propaganda, the endless hate, All of it felt distant, absurd. These were young men feeding those they were told to despise. And these were women, broken, defeated, realizing their captors still saw them as human. Some of the women began to eat in silence. Others stared at the soldiers, trying to understand. One whispered, "Why are they doing this?" No one answered, perhaps no one knew. Hours passed. The sun began to set over the camp, painting the barbed wire gold. The air turned cold again, but something in the women had changed. They sat together outside their barracks, holding their blankets tight, talking in hushed tones. Some spoke of their children, some of their lost homes, others of the food. That simple, blessed meal that felt like an act of forgiveness. As the night deepened, one of the guards walked past, carrying a lantern. Its light flickered against the frost. The women watched him in silence. Anna whispered, "He looks like my brother." And perhaps he did. Perhaps that was why her heart hurt. Because beneath the uniforms, the flags, the ruins of ideology, they were all someone's child, someone's sibling, someone waiting to go home. That night, none of them could sleep easily. They lay awake listening to the wind hum against the fences, to the far-off sound of laughter from the American quarters, and to their own thoughts whispering that maybe, just maybe, peace didn't begin in grand declarations or signatures on parchment. Maybe it began here, in small, unspoken moments of mercy between enemies who no longer wanted to fight. The next morning, they woke to the smell of bread again. And though they were still prisoners, their hearts felt lighter. The fear hadn't vanished. It never could, not entirely, but something else had taken its place. A fragile, trembling hope. And so, as they lined up once more, as the sun rose over the quiet camp, and the guards passed by with nods instead of shouts, the German women realized that this captivity was not what they'd imagined. They were not being broken. They were being reminded that even after everything, after all the death, the hatred, the loss, humanity could still reach across the wire. One soldier walked by and smiled, just a small, tired smile. But it was enough, and somewhere deep inside, beneath the layers of fear and guilt, something began to heal. They were told to sit. The words came softly from one of the guards, a young American, no older than 20, his tone neither commanding nor cold. It was strange, almost unthinkable, to hear gentleness from the mouth of an enemy. The German women hesitated, their instincts whispering that this was some cruel test, that kindness was only a mask before the blow. But then they saw the long wooden tables arranged beneath the open sky, and beyond them the smoke rising in thin blue streams from the camp's cooking fires. The air carried a scent that stopped them where they stood, meat simmering, onions frying, fresh loaves cooling on rough, cut boards. No one moved at first. The prisoners exchanged glances, suspicion mingling with a hunger too deep to name. They had gone days, some weeks, on nothing but watery broth and hard crusts of bread. Their bellies were tight with emptiness, and the sight of real food, food that looked alive, made their throats ache. "Sit," the soldier said again, quieter this time. His eyes darted nervously between the women, as if he feared they would bolt like frightened animals. Slowly, one by one, they obeyed. The benches were crude, but to the women they felt almost like comfort. Around them, the camp had fallen into a hush. The only sounds were the scrape of boots, the crackle of the fires, and the distant cry of a crow circling above. A few of the women kept their heads down, afraid to meet the gaze of the soldiers who stood nearby. Others stared openly, trying to read their captors' faces. searching for any hint of mockery. But there was none. The Americans didn't sneer, didn't leer, didn't laugh. They moved with quiet precision, carrying metal pots and large ladles, their sleeves rolled up, the smell of stew growing stronger by the minute. The women's hearts pounded. It was too kind, too normal. They couldn't reconcile this scene with the war they'd lived through. The bombings, the fear, the endless propaganda telling them these men were savages. Yet here they were, being served a meal like guests rather than enemies. Anna, the same young woman who had first tasted bread the day before, sat frozen, hands clasped tight in her lap. She watched as one of the soldiers, tall and freckled, set a steaming bowl in front of her. The heat fogged the air between them. For a moment, neither spoke. Then, softly, the soldier said, "Eat! You're safe now." His German was broken, but the meaning hit her like a hammer. Safe. The word had become foreign to her ears. She hadn't been safe since before the war began. Anna lifted the spoon with trembling fingers. The steam kissed her face, and her throat tightened. The first sip burned her tongue, but she didn't care. It was real food, thick with potatoes, vegetables, and bits of meat, salt, warmth, and life. Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. She tried to blink them away, but they fell anyway, one after another, silent and unstoppable. Around her others began to eat too. The sound of spoons scraping bowls filled the air, mingling with soft gasps, quiet sobs, and the occasional stifled laugh of disbelief. For so long they had been taught that their captors were monsters. But monsters didn't feed you like this. At one table, a woman named Marta covered her mouth as she ate, ashamed of her tears. The soldier standing nearby noticed. He knelt beside her, speaking gently. "You don't need to hide." She didn't understand his words, but his tone was enough. She lowered her hand, cheeks flushed, and nodded weakly in thanks. For the Americans, this was routine. Another camp, another group of prisoners to manage. But even they could feel that something in this moment was different. These weren't defiant soldiers. These were mothers, nurses, secretaries. Ordinary women caught in the collapse of a nation. Feeding them wasn't victory. It was an act of restoration, a quiet defiance of everything the war had tried to destroy. The sun hung low above the camp, bleeding gold across the sky. Shadows stretched long over the ground, and the fires burned low, their smoke curling lazily upward. Some of the women had finished eating, others sat motionless, staring at their empty bowls as if they couldn't believe what they had just experienced. Then, as if drawn by instinct, one woman, older, with grey streaks in her hair, folded her hands together and began to whisper a prayer. Her voice trembled, but it carried through the air, soft and clear. Others followed. It wasn't a prayer for Germany, or for victory, or even for freedom. It was a prayer of thanks, for life, for food, for a moment of humanity in a world gone mad. The soldiers stood quietly, heads slightly bowed. No one told them to move, no one rushed them. It was as if time itself had stopped to listen. When the prayer ended, the women began to talk, hesitantly at first, then in hushed bursts of conversation. They spoke of their homes, their children, the way the bread had tasted, the warmth of the fire. Some even laughed, a sound so fragile it felt like it might shatter if touched. One of the younger soldiers, the same one who had told Anna she was safe, walked to the edge of the clearing and sat down, his helmet resting beside him. He looked tired too. The women watched him in silence, unsure whether to speak. Finally, Anna gathered her courage. In broken English, she said, "Danke, thank you." He looked up, surprised, and smiled. "You're welcome," he replied simply. It wasn't much, just words. But in that exchange, something unspoken passed between them. An understanding that went beyond uniform, beyond language, beyond war. As the sun dipped lower, the camp came alive with small human sounds. The clatter of dishes being gathered, the low murmur of guards talking softly, the rustle of blankets being laid out. The women were told they could rest near the fire before returning to their quarters. Some sat close, hands outstretched toward the flames, savoring the warmth. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the twilight. For a brief, fragile moment, the war outside the fences ceased to exist. The women were no longer prisoners, and the soldiers no longer wardens. They were just people sharing the simplest, most powerful act of peace, a meal. Anna stared into the flames, her mind wandering back to her family. Her mother's kitchen, the smell of stew on cold winter nights, the laughter of her little sister. She hadn't thought about home in months. It had always been too painful. But tonight, the memory didn't hurt as much. Tonight, it felt like a promise that life could begin again. Marta sat beside her, holding a small piece of leftover bread. She turned it over in her hand, then wrapped it carefully in a scrap of cloth. "For tomorrow," she whispered. Anna nodded, though she understood that the bread wasn't really for hunger. It was a reminder of kindness, of decency, of a moment when the world had made sense again. Across the fire, one of the guards, the freckled one, watched them quietly. He didn't see enemies anymore. He saw women who had been through hell, just like the rest of them. He thought of his own mother back home in Kansas, and for the first time, he felt a flicker of guilt for how easily the world had turned people into labels. The fire burned low. The stars emerged, faint at first, then in clusters, spreading across the sky like a blanket of light. The camp was silent except for the soft breathing of the women and the distant murmur of the guards changing shifts. That night, no one cried from fear. The tears that came were different, quiet, cleansing, full of something almost forgotten, hope. In the years to come, many of those women would tell their children about that meal. They would say that in the middle of their captivity, they tasted freedom, not in the form of release, but in the reminder that kindness could survive even the worst of wars. It wasn't just the food that nourished them. It was the realization that the world had not gone entirely dark, that somewhere, beyond ideology and vengeance, there were still hands willing to feed, hearts willing to forgive. And as the night deepened, and the fire died to embers, Anna closed her eyes and whispered to herself, in the language of home and longing, "Maybe tomorrow will be different." For her, and for all of them, it already was. That night, when the last light of day faded beyond the wire, the camp took on a strange, gentle quiet. The air was cool, and the wind moved softly through the tall grass, carrying with it the faint smell of smoke from the fires that had burned all afternoon. The women sat together in clusters outside their barracks, wrapped in rough blankets, their faces lit by the warm glow of lanterns and the fading embers of cooking fires. For the first time in months, they were not trembling. They were not waiting for the next order, the next explosion, the next loss. For the first time, they were simply still. The American camp wasn't paradise. Not by any measure. The barbed wire still gleamed under the moonlight, a reminder of captivity. Armed guards still paced the perimeter. But the atmosphere had changed subtly, profoundly. The women could feel it in the air. A stillness not of fear, but of exhausted peace. Anna sat near the fence, her knees pulled close to her chest, staring out at the dark fields beyond. The sky was clear, filled with stars, and for a moment she forgot where she was. The sound of distant laughter drifted from the other side of the camp. American voices, relaxed and human. It was such a foreign sound after years of discipline and despair. Laughter, she thought, was something she hadn't heard in its true form since before the war. It wasn't mocking or hollow, it was alive. Behind her, a few of the other women were talking in low voices. They spoke of their families, of sons on the Eastern Front who never came home, of husbands captured or missing, of mothers left behind in bombed cities. They spoke of the war not with anger, but with a kind of weary disbelief, as if they still couldn't comprehend how it had swallowed their lives so completely. One woman, Greta, stared into the fire and whispered, "Do you think they hate us?" Anna turned, her voice quiet. "The Americans." Greta nodded. Anna thought for a moment, glancing toward the guards who stood at the edge of the courtyard. "If they do," she said softly, "they hide it well." A few of the women laughed quietly at that, not because it was funny, but because it was true. There had been no shouts, no slaps, no cruelty, only structure, routine, and an unexpected gentleness that none of them could make sense of. One of the guards walked past, a young man with dark hair and a lantern swinging at his side. He paused when he saw the group of women sitting near the fire. For a moment there was silence. Then he lifted the lantern slightly and said something in English that they couldn't quite catch. His tone was calm, almost kind. He gestured toward the sky, and when they followed his hand, they saw it, a shooting star tracing a thin, brilliant line across the heavens. The women gasped softly. Some made the sign of the cross, others simply stared, their faces bathed in the soft light. The guard smiled faintly, nodded, and continued his patrol. When he was gone, Greta murmured, "Do you think he wished for something?" Anna didn't answer. She didn't need to. In that moment, every one of them had wished for the same thing: to go home, to feel whole again, to believe that life could still hold beauty after so much horror. The night grew colder. One by one, the fires began to die down. The guards changed shifts, their boots crunching softly on the gravel paths. The women retreated into their barracks, each lost in her own thoughts. The barracks were simple, long wooden buildings with rows of bunks, the scent of straw and soap lingering faintly in the air. But even this felt like grace after the filth of the transport camps. Anna lay awake on her bunk, staring at the ceiling beams above her. The image of the American soldier handing her bread that afternoon replayed in her mind again and again. His words, "You're safe now," had struck something deep within her, something she had almost forgotten she possessed. The belief that kindness could still exist. She turned her head slightly. Across from her, Greta was already asleep, her face softened in the dim light. For the first time in a long time, Anna wasn't afraid to close her eyes. The following morning dawned in silence. The camp stirred slowly to life. Guards changing watch, the smell of coffee drifting from the American kitchen, birds calling somewhere beyond the wire. The women rose, stretching stiff limbs, their breath misting in the cool morning air. They lined up outside for roll call, their uniforms still wrinkled, their hair unkempt, but their faces calmer. The same freckled soldier from the day before, the one who had served them stew, passed by, carrying a crate of supplies. He nodded to them in passing, a simple gesture, but it carried more weight than words. One of the women, Marta, whispered to Anna, "Do you think they do this for all prisoners?" Anna thought of the way the Americans had worked in silence, how they'd treated the meal like something sacred. "I don't know," she said. "But maybe they do it because they can." Later that day, the women were assigned light labor, washing, sorting, helping organize supplies. It wasn't forced, not the way they'd feared. The guards spoke softly, their tone firm but fair, and when midday came, they were given another meal, simpler this time, but still warm, still filling. It was strange how quickly their bodies began to remember what it meant to be cared for. That evening, as the sun set once more, a few of the American soldiers brought out a small radio. They placed it near the fire and turned the dial until a song crackled through the static. A slow, melodic tune, soft and sentimental. The melody drifted through the camp like a memory. The women stopped what they were doing and listened. It wasn't German music, but it didn't matter. It was gentle, human, and for a moment, it felt like peace had a sound. Anna watched one of the soldiers tap his foot to the rhythm. She felt a pang of something she hadn't felt in years. The faintest spark of joy. A few of the women smiled at each other. One even hummed along, her voice barely above a whisper. No one stopped her. No one barked orders. The guards simply listened too, their faces distant, thoughtful. When the song ended, the camp fell quiet again. The radio clicked off, and the night reclaimed its stillness. But the moment lingered, a brief, shared pause in which no one was enemy or prisoner or victor. They were all simply tired souls, floating in the aftermath of something far larger than themselves. As darkness settled once more, Anna thought about how easily hatred had spread during the war. How entire nations had been taught to despise one another, to see monsters instead of people. Yet here, in this small camp surrounded by wire and watchtowers, she saw something she could hardly believe: compassion crossing the divide. The Americans didn't have to feed them well, didn't have to offer kindness. But they did. And that act, that quiet defiance of cruelty, meant more than any flag or speech or treaty ever could. She thought of what the war had taken, her brother, her home, her youth, and realized that perhaps what mattered now was not what had been lost, but what could still be saved. A few days later, word spread among the women that some of them might soon be released. The war was over. Officially, and many would be sent home in the coming months. Yet the thought of leaving stirred unexpected emotions. They wanted freedom, yes, but they also knew that beyond these fences lay a world still scarred, still divided. Inside the camp, for all its confinement, they had found something rare: understanding. That night, as the camp fires burned low, and the stars shimmered once again over the quiet fields, Anna found herself sitting beside one of the guards, the same freckled soldier. He didn't speak, and neither did she. For a long while, they simply sat, listening to the crickets, the faint rustle of trees, the breathing of a world slowly beginning to heal. "Finally," he said almost to himself, "war makes us forget we're people." Anna didn't understand the words fully, but she felt them. And somehow that was enough. She nodded. He looked at her, smiled faintly, and stood to leave. But before he walked away, he gestured toward the fire and said, "Peace starts small." Then he was gone, his figure swallowed by the darkness. Anna stayed there for a long time, the words echoing in her mind. Peace starts small. Maybe it did, with a loaf of bread, a bowl of soup, a shared smile between enemies who had stopped seeing each other as monsters. When she finally rose to return to her barracks, The night was silent except for the gentle crackle of the dying fire. She looked up at the sky once more, at the same stars that shone over every home she'd ever known, and whispered a quiet promise, not to forget, not to let this moment fade into the noise of history. Because long after the barbed wire was gone, long after the uniforms were folded away and the world tried to rebuild, she would remember this, the night they were fed not as prisoners, but as human beings. The night they were reminded that even in defeat, even in shame, compassion could still find its way across a battlefield.